little things. Oh, you might want to just do that when Chris is on. So, that
There you
started
go.
a little while ago. So Chris is a returning guest speaker with us from last year. He has written and published a couple of books, and he also talks about affordable housing. Oh, I mixed this all up. Oh, sorry. Chris is a president of the Landlord Association in Durham and is also a commercial real estate broker of recorded Aztec Realty in Toronto, specialized in income generating and multi-residential investment properties. He's hands-on, operate and owns several small apartment buildings totaling 71 units. That's a lot. And has been an outspoken advocate for affordable housing for many years. And Chris will share your information afterwards. That way there we can continue getting all those nice emails from you with the group. So she's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you will see, you see my my notes?
Yes,
Search
I do.
affordable housing causes versus symptoms, blah, blah, blah. Yes? Okay. So again, my apologies for being late. I had a seniors moment. I want to just start with the caveat, as I always do with these presentations. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an accountant. I'll be speaking to everyone based on my experience as a landlord and based on the information I've gathered over the years from different speakers that have come to our landlord association. Pardon me, Nancy's already talked about my credentials, so I'll just move on to the next thing here. Affordable housing is a complex problem, and I am, and that would seem like an obvious thing to say, but I've read so many articles and heard so many people, including even the Ontario task force, minimalize this problem and actually forget or not talk about many of the influences I'm going to talk about tonight. Before we go there, I don't want to get too much involved in what's causing unaffordability and unavailability, because that's been talked about until we're blue in the face. I really want to get to the point of providing some of the solutions. I've got 9 pages of solutions, and time here won't even permit that, but I'm happy to share the presentation with anybody that wants it. They can just send me an email. And at the end of the presentation, I'll have my email listed there. But the definition of affordability is a big issue, and CMHC defines it as someone, a homeowner or a renter should not be spending more than 30% of their income, their gross income, on living expenses. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 out of 4 tenants today spends over 50% of their income. So unaffordability for renters is about not being able to pay for the rent and have money left over for other things. So it's all about money. And unaffordability for homeowners, obviously, is that even if you're making $150,000 a year, it doesn't mean you can buy that home in downtown suburbia. If you can only afford $800,000 and a house costs $1 million, then you're in the same unaffordability crisis situation that somebody at the low end of the affluence scale is experiencing. So it's not just about price to income, which is that's how CMHC defines it, and that's fatally flawed. The other thing that I had was a bit of an epiphany, and that is that there's all kinds of legislation that governs homeowners and their ability to buy a home, and the lender's legislated right to qualify that person to the nth degree to make sure that they can afford to pay for it. Renters don't have that, and it's left on the shoulders of landlords to do that job for them. And when we try to qualify in the same way that lenders do, as we try to qualify tenants in the same way that lenders do for borrowers, we get accused of all kinds of issues with respect to human rights code and the violations and the breach of, privacy and the breach of racism. Well, sorry, not a breach, but we're accused of prejudices and racisms and other things. And politicians really need to step back and understand that we treat tenants, I would like to believe that we treat tenants in exactly the same way that lenders treat borrowers. And as far as I'm concerned, I think I could take 85% of all the problems between landlords and tenants and boil it down to two things. Number one, I want the rent paid on the first of the month in full by the method that that we've agreed to. And the second is I want the tenant to respect the property and respect their neighbors. And if you take all the problems that you can think of, I'll bet most of them will boil down to those two situations. And regardless of what the government says, what tenant advocates say, what tenants say, this is about money. Anything else, in my opinion, is altruistic or deliberate misdirection. When we look at the government solutions, they're always talking about, wow, we'll just add a tax for speculation, or we'll add a tax for vacancy, or we'll add a tax for, the latest one was adding a tax for renovictions. If we do some kind of a renovation, if we charge too much rent relative to the cost of the renovation, then they're going to tax us. So regardless of how you look at these taxes and whether or not they're well-intentioned, I don't believe they are. I think it's just another cash grab, and it's another way for them to raise revenues on the fear-mongering that they do. But regardless of how you look at any tax, it adds cost. And that is counterintuitive to creating affordable housing. I don't care what the tax is, you're adding a cost. And whether it's the buyer or the renter, they're paying for it, because all the seller or the landlord's going to do is pass that cost on. So it's, again, fatally flawed strategy. I'm going to zip through some of this stuff because I really want to get to the heart of the material. And I want to point something else out here. If you think about all of the costs that are involved, where the money is going in real estate, you'll see that I've highlighted that the government takes a big, big chunk. And a lot of the revenue, whether it's municipal or provincial, a lot of that revenue that they generate comes from real estate. And it comes in the form of property taxes, corporate taxes, capital gains tax, recoverable capital cost allowance, land transfer tax, development charges, and the list goes on and on. And I made a list here, but again, I'm not going to dwell on it. I just want to point out that many of the costs are from government. And there's a message that I want to get here to landlords, but also to government, that they need to understand that they, well, let's just take a couple of the stress tests was another big one. Cash in lieu, if you've never heard of that, the developers have to pay for parklands and other things. And if they don't build it into their development site, then instead of creating or building that development or that, promising the land, they'll pay cash. And the GTA currently has a $5 billion surplus, which they're not using. And where would you put that money? Well, I would suggest that they start looking at affordable housing. In fact, I would suggest that the federal government should not give any municipality any money until they've exhausted those kinds of bank accounts. Other influences. One of the big influences that we have right now, and I'll come back to that. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So the conclusion here is that the government adds substantial costs in all the different kinds of taxes that they bring and place on real estate, especially on housing. The other thing that almost nobody knows, in Ontario in particular, is that it's not the landlords that pay property tax. You might think that you're paying the property tax because you remit it, but you're not. It's the tenants who pay that property tax, and we collect it in exactly the same way that retailers collect HST on behalf of provincial sales tax. And if you don't believe me, I can prove it offline. It's built into the Residential Tenancies Act. And I'll give you two very quick and simple examples. If we were not remitting that tax on behalf of the tenants, then the cities could not send a letter to the tenants saying, by the way, your property taxes have dropped. You do not need permission from your landlords. You can automatically deduct this amount from your rent whenever that period begins. So the tenants, the municipalities send letters to the tenants saying that they can reduce their rent because property taxes dropped. The only way they could do that is if the tenants were in fact paying for it. So if you look at how municipalities and others get their money, it's based on the assessed value. MPAC determines what that value is, and the cities collect on the value of that property. So it goes to say that if the value of the property drops because it's more affordable, then their revenue is going to drop. And that's for everything. The land transfer tax is based on the value of a property. Property taxes are based on the value of a property. The depreciation that you take is based on the value of a property. So the government has a conflict of interest. The more affordable they create housing, the more impacted their revenue stream is. And how are you going to solve that? Well, they're going to have to raise taxes. Oh, well, wait a minute. If they raise taxes, then they're making the housing less affordable. So it's a vicious circle, and that's the paradox that I've come to realize, is that the more affordable housing is, the less affordable it is to government. So they have a conflict of interest, and maybe they recognize that. I'll bet a lot of them don't, but the ones who do are paying lip service. I want to be clear. I've looked at studies, especially one that occurred in between 2012 and 2016 in the United States and Kansas. I think it was a Republican government that came into power, and they wanted to create a minimalist government, and they cut taxes left, right, and center. And if those of you who are old enough will know that California did that back in the 1970s, and the infrastructure, the municipal infrastructure was devastated. And in Kansas, the whole economy crashed. So I'm not against taxes. I want to see that the taxes are being properly utilized, and they're not. They're being wasted in all kinds of ways, and I'm going to touch on some of that. The greatest shortages, by the way, for housing in the G7, Canada has the lowest number of houses per 1,000 people, or per capita. Canada. And in Canada, Ontario has the lowest number of houses for the whole country. So in the whole G7, Ontario has the lowest amount of housing. And you have, and the question, the overarching question that needs to be asked is why? And my opinion is that we have an incredibly socialist perspective where all of our parties play to the pandering of the votes of the tenants and have passed all kinds of legislation. And it just occurs to me as as I'm speaking now, that we have an inflation rate of somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. But our rent increase for the year forever can never, ever be more than 2.5%. Some politician passed a law 5 or 6 years ago that said that we can never have a higher rate. So as inflation skyrockets, we're going to be strangled by that kind of idiotic legislation that's not tied to our true costs, even though rent increases are supposed to be tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, right? We're not going to get anything more than 2.5%, even if our costs go up 30 or 40%. Everybody talks about, and I cannot stop being amazed by the number of times I hear, we need the government to build more housing. But let me tell you where the government stands on this. Ontario has a $400 billion deficit, $401 billion as of 2021. And that deficit is higher than 168 countries, including Russia, Sweden. Ontario doesn't have the money. You know, that's the simple truth of it. So if you think that you're going to get the government to pony up money to build housing, and RBC believes that in order for us to meet our minimum goal as an average across Canada of housing per capita, Ontario immediately today needs 650,000 homes. So 35 here, 1,000 there, even 4,000 here and there is irrelevant. And Trudeau has decided that we're going to bring in 400,000 immigrants per year for the next 3 years. Statistically, 45% of those people will come to Ontario. So where are those 200,000 people going to live? Toronto in 2013 had a $2.6 billion backlog in repairs. And in 2017, they had to close down 1,100 units. How long will it take for Toronto to replace those 1,100 units? They're building 200 here, 300 there, and then they lose 1,100 units. The Ministry of Housing announced in 2019 that by 2025 or 2027, I think I might have it here, by 2027, Ontario will lose 106,000 affordable housing units. So I don't care how much the politicians promote their concept that they're building all kinds of housing and they're meeting demand. When you're faced with 1,100 units in Toronto and 100,000 units in Ontario, it's not going to get better. So I hope I painted an ugly, dark picture for you, because when you're at the bottom, now I can lift you up. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that I hope that didn't sound too grandiose or too much hubris. I didn't mean it that way. I just believe there are all kinds of ideas that the government either chooses not to look at or is getting the wrong advice from the wrong people, and they're not talking to the other half of the market. 49% of all the housing in Canada is in the hands of unincorporated individuals. That means that 51% are all the big guys, but 49% are all of us. And I can tell you, I have never once heard from anyone, any study, any survey from any level of government that is talking to the small and medium-sized landlords, even though we represent half of the market. Let's just zoom by here. 87% of the total public debt of Ontario has been created in the last 30 years. 87% since we became a province in 1867. The Ontario Financing Authority basically said, government's not doing anything different than they've ever done before, despite all the hoopla, despite all the programs that they've come up with. I came up with two really innovative proposals that I gave to CMHC. I submitted a formal application. They were looking for out-of-the-box thinking. I gave them out-of-the-box thinking. Some of it you'll see here. They told me with a straight face that none of these ideas fit within the boxes of the programs that they've defined. You know, I think of Homer Simpson at that moment. That's a Homer Simpson moment. Duh. If we looked at that $5 billion that we were talking about, or the $40 billion, the $5 billion at the municipal level, or the $40 billion at the federal level, I'm assuming 187,500 per unit is what it would cost today at $250 a square foot. It turns out that that number is low. It's probably more like 225 to 250,000. But even at 187,000, or there, the Whitby homeless project, and I give a thing here, it's 245,000. But if you looked at that number and you took that $40 billion over 10 years, it's 189,000 housing units across Canada. We need 650,000 in Ontario alone. And this will take them 10 years to build. So it ain't gonna happen. I'll skip over some of this stuff. Municipal and provincial governments simply don't have the money. Who does? Well, I just told you. 98% of all the housing that was built in Canada was built by us, by the private sector, not by public housing. 2% of all the housing in Ontario was built by the, pardon me, was built by the private sector. Sorry, 2% of all the housing in Canada was built by the public sector. 98% was built by us. All right, there's some stats, there's some numbers. There are no holy grail quick fixes. Anyone that says we'll solve the problem by putting on a speculator tax because 15% of all the houses that were bought were flips and, you know, that kind of nonsense. Well, that's not going to change anything. Well, we got over 1 million homes in Canada, or maybe it's Ontario, I'm not sure, but we have over 1 million homes that are vacant. That's also not true. Those numbers are nowhere near, which was it? Financial Post recently reviewed those numbers and said that that's nonsense. So whatever solution we do come up with, it has to be sustainable. And putting out affordable housing that's 30% below market is not sustainable. That's why we're losing 106,000 homes over the next 5 years. You can't build an apartment building and then not put money aside to build the capital replacements that are required over the life of the building, such as a new furnace or boiler or a new roof or new windows. This is why so much of public housing falls into disrepair and ultimately becomes slums in a great many cases, because they don't create sustainable housing. So here are some actionable items. The first one is the one that I gave to CMHC. I call it PAIR, Public Agency Insured Rent. And the idea there is that agencies come to me almost weekly. If it's not, and when I say an agency, I'm not just talking about, you know, a government housing agency. I'm talking about the Red Cross and synagogues, mosques, and churches, and the YMCA, YWCA, and all these other people who are all looking for housing for their particular clientele. They universally tell me that they cannot guarantee me the rent because they don't know what money they're going to have next year. That's the number one excuse. And when I say, all right, so I'm going to take on these tenants that we have no training in managing, you have all the training, you have the staff, you have the infrastructure to deal with them, yet you want me to take over all of that liability and all that responsibility, both legal and not just for the tenant, but also for all the other tenants that could be affected by the behavior of those tenants that they're talking about. And it's that kind of expectation that creates the vulnerability or the vulnerable groups that we talk about. I'm suggesting that CMHC take $2 billion out of that $40 billion that they're getting from the government and insure the agency so that the agencies cannot meet their obligation. You know, they sign a 5-year lease with me and say, I'll be responsible for the damages. I'll take care of the tenants. The only tenant you will have is me. Let's say it's the United Way. and the United Way will be responsible. And then they can take care of the tenants. They can turn them over as they need it. And if damages occur, they will pay those damages. If they came to me and said, I will take care of the damages and I'll make sure you get paid on the first of the month and I'll take care of the utilities, I would only rent to them. I am sure that thousands, if not tens of thousands of landlords would do the same thing. How do you do that? CMHC ensures that agency, so that if they can't meet their obligation, then we as a landlord could apply and say, this agency was not able to meet their commitment. Here's our lease agreement. Please fulfill that commitment. Correctional services. When you think of this and someone, from a jail doing some work, the first thing you think of is a fat-bellied sheriff with the teardrop sunglasses sitting on an Alabama highway, or somewhere in the South or Texas with a shotgun, and there's 15 prisoners building the roads. Well, I'm not suggesting that, but I do think that there are an awful lot of people in our correctional facilities that are not violent, that have been incarcerated for nonviolent reasons, and some of them have committed crimes just because they get better housing, better food, and better medical attention by being in prison than they would if they were on the street. So why not give them a skill of some kind, electrician, a plumber, a carpenter, bricklayer, whatever. And it's something that's rewarded. It's not something that is just freely given. Much like the old days when, if you got the job in the kitchen or in the prison hospital, that was a perk. And this would be the same kind of thing. I can tell you, because I went and spent $1 million and built an affordable home and closed it after a year. And the reason I closed it was because, number one, the insurance company said that affordable housing for seniors was more risky than any other type of real estate property, including students. And I have this from the horse's mouth in writing, and I'm willing to stand up and prove it. But more importantly, lenders will not finance it, because affordability means that the income will be low. Naturally, that's what it's supposed to do. Well, if affordability is low and the income is low, that's right. If affordability is low and the income is low, then the spread in the difference between the loan that is given to you and the money that you pay down, which we call equity, that equity will also be small. That means that the lender's exposure is much higher, especially if the interest rates rise. So lenders will not finance affordable housing. And that's what CMHC was there for, was to ensure that if we as the private sector wanted to build affordable housing, CMHC would insure it. But CMHC is a for-profit corporation. No matter what they say, no matter what the government says, CMHC is in it to make money, because they have the ultimate responsibility that if something happens of a catastrophic nature like 2008, they will have the money to be able to shore up the housing market. And that gets into a long conversation, which I don't want to get into here because we don't have the time. But CMHC in the past couple of years blew their brains out. The leadership of that company did some really stupid things. And you guys may not realize it, but they took away your ability to extract money for your retirement. A few years ago, we could take money out and use that money for whatever we wanted. CMHC took all that away from us. The only way you can get that money back is get that money out is if you reinvest that money into your property to improve it, or you buy another property. I don't know all the details, and maybe they've changed that policy with new management, but as far as I know, that's still where it stands. The bottom line, though, is no lenders, no money, no housing. Not just no affordable housing, no housing. All right. But the money exists. And ironically, one of the things that the government did, which blew up in their face and backfired, like so many other things do. And I may sound pretty anti-government right now, and I apologize for that passion. But after having studied this for so many years and putting together this presentation, I've come to the conclusion that the government simply doesn't listen or doesn't want to listen. But the money exists. So one of the things that the government did was they created a really cheap supply of money. And that was great. It was supposed to spur the economy, which to some extent it did. And housing went through the roof. But what they did inadvertently was empower all the people who already own homes to increase the equity in those homes. The prices went through the roof, but the mortgages didn't change. In the last 2 years, prices have gone up, what, 25% or more, depending on the market you're in. But your mortgage, if it was locked in for 5 years as a closed fixed, didn't change, which means your equity grew exponentially. That means that the haves have a hell of a lot more and the have-nots have much less. So the government has created this massive increase in the gap between the haves and the have-nots. That sounds like a recipe for, well, something disastrous. But having done that, the government inadvertently also created an incredible amount of equity that if they would only, as I'm sorry, I didn't get the fellow's name who spoke at the beginning from the Chamber of Commerce. Jim, was it? I'm sorry, you're muted, Nancy, so I can't hear it.
Greg Piccinera. Greg.
Ray?
Greg.
Okay. He was speaking about second suites, and I'm going to get to that, but we have—
He's still here.
I'm sorry?
He's still here. He's still in the chat.
Oh, okay, great. Okay. Well,
Yeah,
he
one
was
sec.
speaking to some extent about second suites, and I want to talk about that. But in particular, there's literally tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in equity that's sitting there in these homes that we could extract, that lenders would happily loan if there was an incentive for the home buyers to open up their homes. And what that incentive would be, obviously, is we'll rent out our place to you, and you can offset our mortgage costs. I mean, that's as old as the hills, and that's brain dead obvious. But when the homeowners start looking into that, they discover the legal and financial risks, especially the Residential Tenancies Act, which is absolutely brutal against landlords. And tenants will, and their advocates will scream blue bloody murder, frankly, pardon my language, that that the tenancy legislation is so anti-tenant. Sorry, that the residential tenancies legislation is so anti-tenant. Let me put that in perspective. There are 46 breaches, potential breaches of the Residential Tenancies Act. Out of those 46, 34 of them uniquely benefit the tenant to the detriment of the landlord. Out of the remaining, 10 of them are balanced between the landlord and the tenant. That leaves 2. One of them uniquely benefits the landlord to the detriment of the tenant. And that's the ability to go into a unit with 24 hours notice. Hardly a major, grant of right, if you will. And then there's one left, and it has nothing to do with landlords or tenants. It is the right of a government official, usually a canvassing politician, that they cannot be kicked off the property. That has nothing to do with landlords or tenants. But that shows you some of the mindset of the politicians who craft this stuff. Condo construction model solved the issue that public housing runs into every day of the week. They create a reserve fund. Why can't we create legislation that forces public housing to create a reserve fund so that they can deal with the capital costs as they rise? Well, the answer that municipalities give is that money could be used to keep the costs of rent down. Well, sure, until the day that you have to close 1,100 units because you've got a $2.5 billion deficit because you never fixed the things. So, again, fatally flawed, short-term, short-sighted. You could solve that problem quite easily by creating a reserve fund. This is the second one that would require a fundamental shift in mindset. But if we could do it, it would solve enormous problems, all kinds of problems. If we could take our residential tenancy agreement and model it after your standard commercial triple net lease. In other words, in a triple net lease, the tenant pays for all of their utilities. They pay so much per square foot. In this case, we pay so much per unit, I guess, but they pay so much per square foot, and everything that is related to the operation of that property is paid by the tenant. Well, I guarantee to you, if you create that model, tenants would not take half-hour showers. They would not leave their windows open in January because they need fresh air, where they got the heat cranked up to the max while we're paying for it, and all those other kinds of things. They would not be abusive to the property if they had to pay for those damages and so on. It would require a paradigm shift in our thinking, but if you did that, the other half of the equation, though, is why would you do that? Or why would tenants allow it? And why would the politicians allow it? And the answer is because you would also give the tenant control over those costs so that they can realize the benefit of the savings. Our single biggest expense as property operators is property tax. And it's anywhere from, at the low end, 10%, at the high end, 20% of our total income. Well, because we're paying that money, the government will not ever give a property tax break to apartment buildings because they think they're helping landlords in some way. But the tenants were actually paying that property tax directly, like they do in the UK, by the way. Every tenant, every house owner pays their property tax to a housing authority, and I forget the name of it. It's a regional or county organization. It's not paid to the landlord. If we could do something like that, then we could set an affordable housing tax, which would be substantially lower than what it is now. All of the municipalities in Durham region, and there are 444, I remember the number, that's it's such an odd number. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario. Most of them are abusive in their tax policies. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And all of them in Durham are in the top 20 most abusive, where they charge between 2.5 times more property tax on an apartment building than they do on single family homes. Who is more affluent as a general rule? People who own homes or people who are renting apartments? Now, obviously there are exceptions in the rental business, but for the most part, most of the people, especially at the lower, working class level, are all in rental properties, and they're paying twice the property tax that the rest of us are. The construction industry has more people retiring than going into the business. What's going to happen? Well, you need a bricklayer. They're not $50 an hour anymore. They're going to be $75 an hour or $100 an hour because of supply and demand. If there aren't enough people in the construction business, and the ones who are there are going to be paid top dollar, and costs are going to rise. You've got to do, you as in the government has to do something to start getting the young people back into those construction trades. CMHC kills investor incentives, and they kill a lot of deals. And the reason that, and the way that they do that is that they over exaggerate the expenses such that the value of the property is substantially decreased. When you thought that you were going to buy the property, say for $1 million, and you would get $750,000 from the bank and CMHC would insure it, that was based on your analysis, if you're into this world, using what's referred to as the direct capitalization method. You think you're going to get $750,000. Well, when the CMHC is through doing their analysis, which has nothing to do with the banks, they will value your property not at $1 million, but at $850,000. And then they will give you 75, they will insure 75% of what they say the property is worth, not what the market said that the property is worth, or even what the buyer and sellers agreed to. So they would discount the value of the property and then give you 75% of that. If you have the extra money, because you're going to have to come up with 150,000 on top of what you thought you originally needed. If you do have that money, then you're going to have all that extra equity in there. If you want CMHC to bump up the value of that property, they won't do that, but what they will do is they will graciously increase the loan to value. So instead of borrowing at 75%, you'll have to borrow at 85% of what they say the value is. Well, in order to do that, you have to pay between 4 and 6 times more premium. So it is balanced against you. That's not the words I was going to use, but I'm trying to be kind here. Conversely, so CMHC is messing up all these deals by over-exaggerating the expenses. MPAC, who decides what your property taxes are going to be, and don't forget, they're all being paid by municipalities. MPAC exists and it's completely funded by municipalities. What they do is they over-exaggerate the income and under-exaggerate, if that's the right word, assess the expenses. And they'll say, you've got a tenant in there for 10 years because of rent control, and they're only paying $900. But that's not what the value of the property is, because if you got rid of that tenant, which you'll never do, but if you did, then you'd be getting $1,400. So we're going to assess your property on the value of what it would have been if there wasn't rent control. But they never say that. And then if they find that your expenses are too high, they'll say, well, you're a lousy operator, and we're going to adjust those expenses downwards so that they're in line with what they should be. So CMHC on one end and CRA are killing you on the taxes because your property they've undervalued it, and MPAC overvalues it. And the net result is that they hit you at both ends, and they siphon off a massive amount of money to fund their government. CRA, if you're in this business and you have less than 5 employees, CRA taxes your property income at 50%. If you have 5 employees or more, which all the big guys have, they tax your property at 13%. Well, I'll say enough about that. So who do you think is winning in that game? Obviously, I couldn't say stop saying enough about it. One of the things that we could do that would really make life a little bit easier for us is, instead of amortizing a hot water tank over 15 years, let me amortize it over 3 years. That will improve my cash flow tremendously. That would allow me to invest more of that money back into the property to improve it. But I can't do it when I'm carrying amortizations on everything between 10 and 20 years. The capital cost allowance, if you guys don't know what it is, when you sell your property, you may have been taking depreciation to reduce your taxable income over a 20-year period, or your accountant's done that for you and you didn't even know it. But when all that depreciation is taken, it reduces your taxable income. It's seen as an expense on your books, which means you pay less tax. Yay, that's great. But when you sell the property, the government says your property didn't depreciate, it appreciated. So we want every penny back. So when you sell the property and all the work that you've done over the 20 years, so you have a nice retirement income, the government then takes all of that money back from you. And by the way, that's not enough. They also take 25% of any profit that you made on that property in the form of capital gains. Are you guys getting demoralized yet? I see a couple of people shaking their heads. I already talked about this. Equalized property taxes for all. You want to create affordable housing? The first thing you have to do is create property taxes, because that's the single biggest expense. That has to be the same as everybody else. There has to be equity in the application of tax rates, and it's not. Now, here's one that a lot of people aren't going to like, but they're all wrong, and here's why. Government should not be building any housing except specialty housing. Yes, they should be building the hospitals, they should be building special care centers, shelters, and that type of thing, but they should not be building general purpose social housing. First of all, they don't have the money. Second of all, they don't know how to run those businesses. They run them into the ground, and it's us taxpayers that wind up having to bail them out. But if they really want to use that $40 billion in a useful and constructive way, they should be building infrastructure. And I'm talking about the roads, the fire hall, a library if necessary, or a community center. If they build those infrastructure mechanisms, builders will line up around the block without incentive to build the housing, because they'll make their money. They don't need government money. And certainly billionaire developers don't need government money. Build the infrastructure and they will come. Where do you build this stuff? Well, you can't build it in urban areas. After World War II, most of us would not realize, but there was a massive reconstruction. Whole cities have been leveled and rubble has been left. Not only do you not have a place to build, but you have to get rid of all the rubble. Where are you going to put that stuff? Well, the UK, France, and Germany in particular built whole new cities. And they came up with all kinds of incentives to get rid of that rubble. And it worked all the way from the street cleaner all the way up to the, the large owners who had the facilities to build whole city blocks. We could learn from that stuff. And I would suggest that, that the government should be looking at the reconstruction period after World War II in Europe. There are answers there. I've read some of the stuff. I guarantee to you there are answers there. Another thing that we've got are seniors who no longer, the government for decades always thought, sorry if I'm sort of going on a tangent there a bit, the government always thought that seniors would eventually leave their big homes and downsize. But the baby boomers didn't do that. So the government got caught with their pants down, because all of the baby boomers who are in their oversized houses are saying, well, first of all, I want to age gracefully in place, and I want to be able to capitalize on the only investment that I have, take that money out, go buy a smaller property somewhere. And that's what they did historically. But they're not doing that now, because why? The government created incentives, number one, to get all the people to start investing in homes, but those people are investing in homes in Peterborough, in London, in Temiskaming, in North Bay, and housing prices have gone through the roof there. So the people who are in the bigger cities, who are close to where all the jobs are in downtown and so on, are saying, well, there's nowhere to move to, so I guess I'll just stay where I am. So the government needs to figure out, how can we get, and I'm one of those people, by the way, I'm an empty nester. Two of us live in a house that we don't need anymore. We got 4 bedrooms. If the government gave me a good reason to move, I would do it, but they haven't. In fact, they gave me a good reason to stay. My property has gone up 25%. Increase the funding of tenant rent supplements. Some of these things I'd love to talk about, but I don't have the time. We're at 8 o'clock already. Here's the big one. Remove the massive disincentive to building second suites. The government had planned, the Ontario government had planned on somehow getting homes. They were on the right path when they did this 5-6 years ago, of getting people to build second suites. And second suites are the cheapest or least expensive, easiest to implement types of housing in urban settings that are close to where we want the housing to be, which is near transit, near the amenities and the grocery stores and the places of worship and, you know, all parks and so on. And you're not going to be able to build houses and new condos of any volume that's going to meet the desperate needs that we have today. However, there are tens of thousands of homes that probably have extra space, whether it's in a basement or in an attic, or, you know, even in the driveway where they could convert a garage. But when you look at the disincentives between all the taxes, the money that you're going to make as a return on investment versus the risk, and especially if you brought that person in so you could offset your mortgage costs, and then that tenant doesn't pay the rent for any reason, and it takes 10 months to a year to evict that person rent-free, you will never see a penny of it. And then have somebody, a stranger, live in your home, which is always a little bit, you know, it can be unsettling if you're not used to it. And worse still, they could start a fire, they could cause damage, they could sue you. You know, all the risks that are there are so debilitating that most people are saying there's absolutely no way, no matter what the circumstance is, I'll just take my chances with my mortgage on my own. You want to fix this housing problem, you want to do it fast, build second suites, but before you do that, fix the issues, especially in the Residential Tenancies Act. The RTA has some huge problems, and I'm not going to get into them here. That is a 2.5-hour conversation by itself. But I did write some of the things here, so if you wanted the presentation, you can read them at your leisure. Okay. Above guideline increases. I'll bet most landlords have never heard of the RHEU. It stands for the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit, and that is an agency or a department of the Ministry of Housing. The Landlord and Tenant Board is a department of the Attorney General, but they do the same thing. The difference is 85% of all the applications that go through the RHEU are from tenants, and 91% of all the applications that go through the LTB are from landlords. Why? That's a whole long conversation as well. But the short version of this conversation is merge them together and let's save the taxpayers, you know, $50 million or so, which you could put towards affordable housing and other programs. Stop hiding renters' property tax behind landlords, abandon. Now here's one, I even wrote the letters, oh my God. Why, Chris, would you suggest such a stupid thing as to abandon incentives for first-time home buyers? And the answer is, if you've got an incredible demand already built up, a pent-up demand, and it's already leading to auctions and multi-buyer offers, multi-offers, what the hell's the word for it? I'm having another seniors moment, but multiple offers, sorry, that's what I meant. And you're getting multiple offers, and some homes are getting like 30 offers. Why would you incentivize first-time home buyers and give them whatever that amount is? I don't care if it's $4,000 or $50,000. They still have to compete with all those other people. And let's not forget that the immigrants, not refugees, but immigrants are generally affluent because the country is trying to bring in high quality or high caliber investors and tradespeople and business people who will contribute to the economy. So those people are going to be affluent and they want those homes as much as you do. And the investors have the money because the government gave it to them. We didn't do it. Landlords didn't do it. The government did it. How did they do it? They created low-cost capability, right? Cheap money, very cheap money supply, and they combined that with outrageous disincentives to stop people from building in Ontario. You put those two things together, and we win. Now, that may sound pretty damn snarky, but that's the truth of the matter is, the government has given us all this money. Why would you set up first-time buyers to compete against all of those other people? You've got to increase the supply first, then give them that incentive. Also, give people incentives who are willing to give up their privacy to live together. Put 10 people in a co-living environment, they should get some kind of a tax benefit because they're living in a private bedroom, perhaps with their own washroom, but they're sharing a kitchen, they're sharing a living room and so on. Give them a reason for doing that, and give the people who build these types of properties a reason for building them. Descale rent control, that is suicide. But what I mean by this is no politician will ever look at it because they think that they will blow their brains out politically if they do it. But what you could do is create the incentive first and say that as the supply catches up with demand, there should be a loosening of rent control, because rent control's only purpose was to create affordable housing, and it hasn't worked. What rent control does, it's a savings plan for the affluent. So the people who are at the top end of the rent spectrum or the rental housing market are using rent control to keep their costs down so that they can go and buy a house. But then the government comes along and says, if you want to buy a house, you're going to have to meet a stress test that's twice as high as what the interest rates are, or 2% higher than whatever the market rates are, I think is the thing right now. And they're talking about making it stronger. What did that do? Well, we're supposed to make it harder for people to buy homes so that it would ease off on the prices. Well, that didn't work, obviously. What did happen, though, is 200,000 families were locked out of being able to buy a home. So where did they stay? In rental properties. Well, if they're staying in rental properties and 200,000 other people who wanted to get into the rental market were locked out by the government's own short-sighted policy. I wrote an expose on the Canadian insurance industry.
Chris?
Yeah, you gotta go?
No, I'm here for.
I'm sorry, am I running out of time?
No, not at all. But I had a question. Whenever I was younger, the government had at the time incentives, so we would be allowed to put $2,000 away prior to purchasing a home, and they would give you $500 back on your income tax.
Right.
So why wouldn't they introduce that again instead of this big, huge stress test where people would have to learn to save?
Because they're reacting to the crisis of the hour, and the crisis of the hour, prices are rising. So they think that by creating a stress test, everything that the government does, 95% of everything the government does, I won't say every single program, but almost all of it, is targeted at reducing demand, not at increasing supply. And even that 40 billion that they said is going to be used to increase supply, that's only 4 billion a year, and that's only going to build 180,000 divided by 10, which is 19,000 homes. 4 billion a year will only build 19,000 homes. So to your point, Nancy, that is a good thing to have, but again, you could be saving forever and never catch up because the supply isn't there. So creating an incentive may create more down payment for you, but if the prices keep on rising beyond your ability to buy a home, then that savings plan is useless. You can only use it to buy a home. You can't use it to do anything else. And if you can never buy a home, you got your money tied up and it's dead money. You could at least use that for education or for your kids' education or something. So I think that program makes sense when you've got more supply, but all you'd be doing is creating more demand and not, and driving prices up as a consequence.
Okay.
So let me come back. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, okay. Yes.
So let me come back to this war profiteering. I do not use those words lightly. And I mean this. the Canadian insurance company has had one of the best years in its living memory in 2021 and 2020. I can't remember. Yeah, 2020. If you go and look at the numbers, which I did, I looked at every single Canadian insurance company, and these guys had a massive increase in profit in the year of a global pandemic when everybody was concerned about whether or not they're going to live or die, let alone whether or not they're going to have a job or be able to make ends meet. This insurance company, I went and filed a formal complaint with the Competition Bureau of Canada, and they said they couldn't do anything about it. And he gave me a bunch of reasons, which will take too long to explain here. But you want to solve this problem? The politicians are the only ones that can solve it. So just moving along, create incentives for the seniors to sell their larger homes. Seniors don't need to live downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa or downtown Montreal. You know, they'd be quite happy in a retirement community. That's what they call them. Peterborough, which is a market I know a bit, 1 out of 3 people who live in Peterborough is over the age of 55. 1 out of 3. You walk into a bank of 6 people, 2 of them are seniors or on the border of becoming a senior. There are ways to free up this housing so that the younger families who need to be close to jobs, who need to be close to transit, who want to be able to not use their car and get onto the subway so they can go to their office skyscraper in, downtown wherever, you could free up those homes. And these homes typically are close to schools. And as a senior, I don't need to be close to a public school or a high school. But I don't hear anybody in government or these special committees or these lettered consultants for the government talking about this stuff. They're talking about rezoning, and they're talking about inclusion zoning, and all this nonsense. Escalate the backlog of entry ports. Our inflation is going through the roof. I think we're going to see hyperinflation like we did in 1980s. Between 1980 and 1990, 50%, Americans who had their money in a savings account lost 50% of their value over a 10-year period. And let's not forget who was in power in 1981 when the interest rates went to a high of 21.6%. Guess who it was? It's the father of the guy who's in power today, who's racked up gazillions of dollars in debt that I'm not sure we're ever going to pay. You may not be aware of this, but as an Ontarian, you and I are paying $9 million an hour on interest. Just on interest. That's where your money's going, your tax money. Back to this national crisis. It's not that we don't, that the parts aren't available. It's that we can't get the parts into the country. There are ships lined up in seaports all around North America, from San Francisco to Nova Scotia and Vancouver to New York City. They're sitting in the docks for weeks. It used to take a day to unload a ship. It takes weeks now. That means that all those costs are being added to whatever is coming off of those ships. You can't make anything affordable if the cost of the stuff has gone up. Lumber went up 4 times. In 1 year, it went up 400%, but so did glass, concrete, and steel. Concrete has become so rare that the big operators are buying supplies of all the concrete that's going to be available 3 years from now. They've bought that concrete. So if you're thinking about building your own home and using concrete, good luck to you. 82% of all the housing that was built in Ontario was built before 1979. I know that. I did the research firsthand. That means the youngest building, 4 out of 5, the youngest building is 40 years old. Our inventory continues to age, and we're not replacing any of it, and yet we have incredible demands, and the return on investment, we call that a cap rate. but the cap rates are down to about 2 or 2.5%. 10 years ago, cap rates were in the neighborhood of 5.5. And if we were in the outlying, outside of the 705, 905 band, then, they could be upwards of 7%. Think of it in the same way that you think of your bank account. You put your money into a bank account, and today you're going to get a 1% return. Well, you'd like to get a 5% return. Well, that's the same with real estate. You want to get a higher return as a buyer. And the sellers are saying, I don't have to give you a return. You want a return? I'm giving you 2%. And that's what a lot of these properties are trading at now. And the people who are trading and buying those properties aren't you and me, because we couldn't finance that at that cap rate. It's impossible. The only people that can do that are the people who are either paying cash, and that's investors offshore. They're the ones that come in with cash most often. They don't borrow from our Canadian banks, or the big operators, because they can afford to lose money for 5 years, knowing that there's a 20%, there'll be a huge upside for them in 20 years. Fix the municipal act. I won't get into all that kind of stuff. I mentioned the rent increase guideline stuff already. This is a big one, NIMBYism. NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard, is responsible for a lot of unaffordable housing. They torpedo high density projects left, right, and center all the time. And the cowardly municipal politicians who want to be voted in next year or want to leave a legacy that they were popular will not make the hard decisions of saying, look, I understand that your house might go down in value because you said so, which is not true. I don't believe it's true. I think that if you increase density, you're going to have more businesses that will cater to that density. You'll have a greater variety of amenities because of it. The local economy will prosper. And with the greater density and those greater number of businesses, you're going to have a greater number of jobs locally. And all of that will create more demand and increase the value of your homes. But you seem to think, not you, I don't mean you as in this audience, I mean NIMBYs in general, of which I am one, I own a home. NIMBYs seem to think that if you build a multi-residential unit on the street, it's going to impact their value. So what they're really saying is it's all about the money. Yeah, you can have affordable housing. I'm all for affordable housing as long as you don't build it on my street. So the value of my home has gone up because of a shortage. Well, why don't you make your money or the value of your home go up because the local economy has increased the value of that property? Because more people want to live here because it's the place that you want to go, not because it's some rustic village that maintains the character from the 1900s. I'm ranting again, so I'll just move on. You can't have your cake and eat it too, government. You can't ask for all kinds of green space and all kinds of parking ratios, and at the same time say, I want to intensify and have more people living in, per hectare than we have today. Every city is mandated to at least double their intensification. I can tell you right now, most of my apartment buildings have one parking space per tenant, maybe, or per unit, not per tenant, per unit. That means maybe I'll have 1 or 2 visitor parking spots. None of my buildings have any kind of handicap parking. There's just no place to put it. I can't even put in a garbage bin facility in one of my properties because the guys won't let me put it on the green space. The city wouldn't let me. They want to charge me $4,000 to do a study, and maybe they won't do it. Well, I'm not spending $4,000 on a maybe. So they're out of luck. They're not getting the parking. We've got nice green lawns, and we're suffering a crisis of people who are homeless. Let that be on your conscience. Electricity is a major cost. For 4 years, the government said, we're not raising your electricity. We're going to give you a rebate. Well, they didn't tell you that a year and a half ago, they increased overnight electricity by 55%. Go back and look at your bills. You'll see that on that line. You still get the rebate, but the rebate's no longer 25%. It's been steadily dropping, and they're not telling you that. Now the rebate is trickling like a, like a creek instead of a river. I think, and one of the things I'm going to be doing is looking into solar power for my rental buildings. They're creating all kinds of solar programs for homeowners, but the homeowners aren't going to see the same return on investment that an apartment building could. And if an apartment building had relatively low cost electricity, I could in fact generate electricity and sell it to my tenants lower than the utility companies could deliver it. Nuclear reactors have a lifespan of 40 years. All of our nuclear reactors in Ontario have come to the end of their life. I think we got 24 of them in 3 sites, and they're all coming to the end of their life, and each one costs $1 billion to refurbish. Well, why don't we offload that in Germany, which has less sunlight than we do? 50% of their, I don't know if it's 50% of the homes or 50% of the electricity that's generated, sorry, but it was a staggering number. I think it's 50% of the homes have some form of complemented or augmented electrical power, whether it's from wind turbines, most of it's solar panels. Some of the best solar panel technology is coming out of Germany right now as well. And I want to do this. I want to become a, what's it referred to, substation. I want to be a licensed substation where I can sell my electricity directly to my tenants. I would still have to pay the same, the same rates. The Ontario Energy Board sets that, so we can't change that. But I won't have the delivery costs, and I won't have the nuclear power refurbishment costs. So I'll be able to sell electricity net a lot cheaper to the tenants, which would also improve my profit picture. They win because they got lower electricity. I win because I've got lower costs and a bit of a profit from providing that service. Well, that's not in the best interest of the province or the government. And who owns electricity companies? Most of them are owned by cities, municipalities, right? Whether it is the upper tier, like a regional Durham, or a city proper. Incentivize for alternative lifestyles. People have talked about that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I'm nearing the end of my affordable or unaffordable housing presentation. I would like you guys to start thinking about not calling yourself landlords. That's a European feudal title that conjures up all kinds of evil impressions that are exploited by tenants, their advocates, and by even the government, and of course by the media. Stop calling yourself landlords. Let's remind them that without us, society would not function. And what do we provide? We're a rental housing provider. Every email I send out now, I call myself a rental housing provider, not a landlord. And when people see it, it gives them pause to say, why the hell is he calling himself that and not a landlord? Oh, he's trying to remind me of the service that he provides. So I would suggest that, one of the ways we could create some kind of grassroots awareness is as something as simple as that. I created a manifesto. Everyone thinks of the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx and the rise of the evil Axis state of communism in Russia and all that kind of stuff. And it's not. All a manifesto is a collection of ideas, policies, views, motives, goals, intentions, and so on that we all share. And I started one of those a couple of years ago. It's here. And as a landlord community, if we could impress upon the government, this is who we are, this is who we are not. One of the things we are not is in the business of providing housing for free. That's the government's job. not ours. We're in the business of making a reasonable return on our investment for the amount of risk that we take, both legally and financially. And that's called capitalism with a small c. And finally, I would encourage you to start thinking about the politicians that you vote for. Most politicians, we think of them, they're supposed to be leaders. Leaders make hard decisions. Our politicians universally are not doing that. They are arbitrators. They are trying to appease and please everyone, and they will never do it. It's an impossible job. And to that end, I truly sympathize. They can't please all the people all of the time. But leaders have to make hard decisions, and I just don't see that happening. Not with any political party. And when I looked at the elections, the federal elections, and I looked at the housing policies, they were all nonsense. They were short-sighted. They were not thought through. They, they didn't consult people who knew this stuff. And if they did, then they consulted the wrong people, in my opinion. Now, if you want, I created a list because most of this stuff I think will fall on deaf ears. I know that sounds really cynical, but having done this for a long time and no one ever paying attention, the very least I can do is give you some ideas on how you can make your property more affordable. Do I have time to do that?
Well, 10 minutes, would that give it enough time, guys?
No, but I'll just skim through the big ones then. And then anybody that wants it can take the list. And if they want to talk about it, I can certainly, do that. But I spend 6 days talking about this. I teach a 6-day course, and it's all about how do you make your property more profitable in this heavily regulated environment where making a profit is very difficult. So let me not belabor, and I'll just zip through here. Suite meter everything. I bought a building. It cost me $890,000 12 years ago. And the first thing I did was I put in an electrical suite meter. It's a meter for every unit. It cost me $1,000 per unit. It saved me $10,000 a year. It took me 5 years to get all the tenants to pay for their own electricity. But once they did that, I had $10,000 in my pocket, and I increased the value of the property by $200,000 by doing that one thing. Do not rent or lease hot water tanks. Companies like Reliance only do this because they make a profit. You will spend between 3 and 5 times more money for peace of mind than you would if you just wait until that hot water tank failed and then you replaced it. I don't have time to explain it because I only got 10 minutes, but do that. If you've got tenants because of rent control who have been there for a long time, buy them out. And I would have to spend, well, it takes me 3 or 4 hours in the course, but it would take me at least 15 minutes now to explain why, if you are able to save $1 in your expense or increase your income by $1 without expense, that's called net operating income. For every dollar that you can increase your net operating income, you will increase the equity in your property by $20. So that $10,000 savings that I had on my suite meters resulted in $200,000 in income. So if I can do that with any tenant who's paying low rents, say they're paying $1,000 today, 10 years from now, they're paying $1,000 today, but you could get $1,500. That $500 a month difference times 12 months is $6,000, times 20 is $120,000. Is it worth it for you today to pay them $1,000 times 6 months, $6,000, to get $120,000 of equity value when your financing comes due, when your mortgage comes due? Well, yeah, you should. Increase your insurance deductible. Most people think that insurance should protect you for everything. Well, no, it's supposed to protect you for catastrophic events. So don't bother with a deductible of $500 or $1,000. get a $5,000 deductible as long as there's a significant reduction in your premium without a reduction in the coverage, the perils that are covered. When I tried to do that in 2020, you know, and I'm talking about, you know, these war profiteering insurance companies, they came back to me. I had a $3,600 insurance premium, and in order to go from $2,000 to $5,000, they offered me a $139 discount. Well, enough said. Separate out your parking from your rent. Charge separately for the parking, because not all tenants need parking, and they don't deserve to be able to have that parking space and rent it out for themselves, because you're the one who is fixing the potholes. You're the one who has to paint the lines and resurface it and do the snow plowing and, you know, and clean it. So you're maintaining a parking lot. Why should they get that benefit? If they don't have a car, don't rent them a parking spot. That means that when they come and say, I don't have a car, I want a discount off the rent, you can say, sorry, the rent already includes no parking. It excludes a parking spot. And if you got tenants in your building who are not using a car, then maybe a more affluent tenant who's applying needs 2 parking spots because they got 2 cars. Now you've got the space to give that to them. Think about your laundry. If your laundry and you're using a coin-op machine, now this isn't going to apply to single family owners necessarily, but if you're using a coin-op and it's at $2 and the market at the local laundromat is $4, and you raise it by $1, so that you're still $1 below, which is what, 25% less, then you've increased your income by 33%. That may not seem like a lot, but in my units, I make about $10,000 a year in income. So by just increasing it by $1, I've now gone from $10,000 to $15,000. That's a big jump. Now, that's not all profit. I have to pay for the water, I have to pay for sewer, I have to pay for electricity, I have to buy the machines. Do not use coin-op operators. They only take 30% of the total income, but they don't tell you that probably 70% of the income is going towards your expenses, which is an exaggeration. But they're taking more than 50% of the profit when they give you those machines. Don't use them, buy them yourself, maintain them yourselves, collect the money yourself. The last point, because I'm running out of time here, well, it won't be the last point, but you tell me when I have to stop, okay? But a key point that I want to make is, if you don't know what loan to value is, that is the amount of money that you put in versus the amount of money that the bank has put in. Because interest rates are going to rise, it's inevitable. It has to happen. And it's going to be significant. If you go from 2% to 4%, you as a buyer might not care that much. It's still below market. You know, traditional market over the last 50 years have been 5 to 7%. So 4% is still great. But if you're paying $11,000 a month like I am for interest on one of my buildings, and it goes from 2% to 4%, when I have to refinance, I'm going to have to pay $22,000 a month. I guarantee to you, my income did not increase in that property to cover that financing. You're going to get massacred. And when those interest rates rise and people have to refinance, there's going to be bloodshed. It's going to be a really ugly market. And you can blame the government for that too.
Last one?
Yeah, we're done?
No,
well, if you want to say one last thing, and then I'll see if
you want to take questions?
Yeah.
Okay, let me
Maybe
see.
Craig?
Let me see what else I've got. All right, so here's the last thing I'll say to you. Point 13. Increase the rent by the maximum that you're allowed by the government every year, because any year that you don't do it because you're feeling sorry for the tenant or they're nice and you don't want to lose them, they're going to stay. They're not moving, not in this market. And if they do, you're going to get more rent anyway. Increase it every year, because that rent increase does not keep pace even with your basic costs, and you will forever be shrinking the net operating income of your property, which means that the equity that you could have in your property is going to shrink as well. I'm done.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Is there
Okay.
any questions? Can you see down the line anything, Justin?
I'm looking now. I don't see anyone. I'm just waiting to see if anyone's gonna give me a hand or anything in the comment or in the chat room.
And is Greg still on? Does he have anything that he wants to add?
From the Cornell.
Yes.
Yeah,
What he's
so
on
no,
now.
I think that was, I enjoyed that. There's a lot of good information there.
Well, I apologize for the emotion.
No, you don't have to apologize for that. You should have read my piece about landlord licensing here.
Well, if you're willing to send it to me, I promise you I'd read it.
It was really good.
And maybe there's some comments. I've seen several programs to incentivize affordable housing that's come out of various cities. In particular, the most recent one came out of Sudbury. And I wrote a 2-page dissertation to all the landlords in Sudbury and North Bay and said, don't do it because it will kill you. And then I gave all the business reasons for it. But that was because the city did not consult. They just said, hey, we got some extra money. We'll give it to you, but on our terms. And the terms were not favorable.
Wow. So one of the meetings that we had went to 10 years ago, they were talking about affordable housing and wanting to do so, but they were being subsidized by the government. So we'll say one of the conversations was they were going to charge $150 to low-income individuals to stay there, but then the government would give them the balance of the money to be able to offset the cost.
And that is definitely the way they should be going with that.
So, and then we're like, well, why don't you help landlords out at the time? Anyways.
No, I think well, the way that you would help landlords can would benefit from the increase in the rents that we see in the market if they allowed the market to stabilize on its own. And then you empower the low income people by giving them a top up of whatever their income is so they can compete effectively against those who have the money. That, I think, is what they should be doing. You know, let the market stabilize on its own and top up. And that's what ODSP tries to do in OW. But you cannot find any place in Ontario, unless you want to, you know, go into the wilderness, where you can get a rental unit for, you know, $420, which is the amount of money that they allow for, I think that they allow for living expense, and then another $300 or so for food and so on. That's $720 total to find a place to live, eat, and clothe yourself.
I think Justin has a question. I see Cheryl's hand.
No,
up.
no, I'm pointing to let Cheryl have her time.
Okay.
I just asked her to unmute now, so if she wants to come on, she can.
So I'm sorry, Chris, I'm seeing on your point number 19.
Yeah.
Don't top up the last month's rent deposit at the end of the year and don't pay interest on it.
Yeah.
Can you explain?
Yeah. So what I'm talking about there is if you have to top up the rent, it's not a big deal if you only own 1 or 2 units, but if you own 70 or 100 or 1,000, and you have to write a check for $25 to top up the last month's rent, the cost of the check processing is larger than the deposit that you're providing. So if you get something in writing in your rental agreement that says we will not top up the last month's rent, so 10 years from now, you know, if they had a deposit of $1,000 and the rent's $3,000, then they're going to get the last month for $1,000. But that's because you didn't pay interest on their money every year, and that is legal. It's allowed in the Residential Tenancies Act because the interest that you pay on that last month's rent is equal to the rent control guideline for that year.
Yes.
And the top up is also equal to the rent control guideline. So it's a wash. And they did that on purpose. And that's probably one of the smartest things that the government did. I don't know when they did it, but it was a smart thing to do. But you can't just not pay them and not top them up. You really need it in writing. So you put that into your lease agreement, or if you've got an existing tenant, you can say, look, this is onerous. You have to write me a check for $22, and then I write you a check for $22. It's stupid. Most landlords may not even realize that you're allowed to top up the last month's rent. You can do that, and they don't,
Okay,
right? But if you
okay, so you don't ask the tenants to top it up. You just
Correct.
put it on, you use the interest to top it up
well,
as a landlord, right?
so in your agreement, you say, I'm not going to ask you to top up the last month's rent so it's always current, because that's the purpose, right? Is to always keep the
Right.
rent current. So that the last month you've got current rent. But what you do instead is say, I'm not going to pay you interest while you're here, and I'm not going to ask you to top up the rent while you're here, but you got to get it in writing.
Okay,
So if they ever renege on that and they go to landlord tenant board, or the LTB says, we want to award you something, but we're deducting all of the interest that you didn't pay, you got to have it in writing so you can say, no, we agreed that we would not pay that in lieu of not topping up.
okay,
The LTB doesn't even have on any of their forms an acknowledgement that the tenant has done that. They automatically, in every single case I've ever heard of, the adjudicator automatically asks, have you paid interest?
interest.
And there's no form, there's nothing on the form that says, no, I haven't paid, but I have an agreement that says that we don't pay. Get it in writing.
Okay. Thank
Sorry.
you.
I have another one. I
Sure,
have another person that has a question here.
go ahead.
Hi, Chris. My name is Eli, and I'm a small landlord in Toronto with just 3 rentals. I'm still trying to get through your book. Much appreciated for all your efforts. Just on this small, tiny question on the screen that we were just showing, number 14. You said the mortgage payments you recommend coming out on the 10th of each month. I'm just curious if you can elaborate why. Thank you.
Well, if you have your mortgage come out on the 1st of the month and you haven't had all your tenants pay enough to cover,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
then you feel obligated to always keep a minimum amount of money in your bank account. That's dead money. And if you got 7 or 8 properties and each one has $2,000 or $3,000 tied up, you've got $20,000. Well, whatever, multiply by 3. You got $9,000 or $10,000 tied up that you will never ever be able to use. However, if you negotiate with your mortgage company that you will pay the mortgage on the 10th of the month, then you know that you will have your mortgage covered, unless you got a single property, for example. But if you got 10 units, you know statistically that 80 or 90% of your money will be in the bank by the 3rd or the 4th. So you don't have to tie up all of that money. In a small operator, it's probably not as significant, but as you grow, it becomes quite significant. And that's what I was talking about there. Don't be afraid to leave a unit empty for 3 months. Do the qualification process, because if you don't, and you wind up losing 10 months, that's why I was saying better vacant than a claimant. And the LTB hasn't given me any reason to believe that that's going to change anytime soon.
True. Greg, is there anything you want to add as well? I just see that you're still muted, so.
Give me 1 sec, I'll get him.
Or
There
if
you go.
anyone has any questions for Greg as well.
I just asked that. And if anyone wants to ask any questions for anyone, just raise their hand and I'll get them as soon as I can.
Awesome. Well, if there isn't any questions, but feel free, we have a few more minutes. Thank you, Chris and Greg, for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure. It has been recorded, so I don't know how to get that to you, but I'm going to leave that in Justin's hands. Are we?
Oh, great. Put it all on me.
Yes, and I'll help you. I've done this a few times, so if you're struggling, I can help you.
Okay.
Sounds good.
And I'm assuming at any time I had given and shared your information with Greg and vice versa, if he wants to touch base on anything else. And are we able to have this presentation for some of the people?
That's why I
that
just scrolled up. I just scrolled up.
Okay, perfect.
So send me an email and I'll send a copy of this presentation that you saw tonight to you.
Awesome. So I will do that tomorrow. And then if anybody else wants to have Chris's email address, he does send out little updates and everything on a monthly basis, I think it is. Like, I seem to
Well,
get one.
it's whenever I see something that is worth commenting on. So sometimes it's 3 times in 1 month and then it's nothing for 2 months. But yeah, I mean, there's probably 12 or so a year.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
you write very well, so I appreciate it. So
Thank you, Nancy.
awesome. So for us, right now, the landlord licensing, the matter was deferred. I'm not sure for how long, whether that gets put into the city's meetings. I think Greg will keep us up to date on that. Guy Willis is writing a draft letter to the city of Cornwall, and I don't think I saw one of those. He's at the cottage, so he doesn't always have good signal, just in case. So, and like I said, I'm still waiting on that letter. The last thing would be, we will be needing some committee members coming for this April's meeting. There's a few changes that are going to be taking place. We'll have a new president, as I'll be stepping down as a reminder. So yeah, so anyone that wants to be a director, we have over 100 members in our group, and it would be nice to have some young blood, people with a lot of properties, a little bit of properties. It's a good learning experience. And then lastly is that our annual general meeting is April, and then if we can have all the dues at $75 annually to be the member, and if you guys can send checks or do an e-transfer to Jean, and then we'll send you a receipt at that point. So so again, it'll be April 11th at 7 p.m., hopefully at the Best Western. That'd be cool. And if there's anybody else in the background that has anything else to say, if not, we'll call it a night. It's almost 9 o'clock. Sure, everyone has a busy day tomorrow. Do you see anything, Justin?
No, I'm not seeing anything, not in the chat or any hands up or anything like that. So,
All right. So, well, again, Chris, thank you again. Greg,
Thanks for
thank
inviting
you. And I'm sure we'll have you on again. Appreciate it so much, you guys.
All the best. Take care.
You
Good
too.
luck.
Have a good night.
Night.
Good night, everybody. So at first we had like 36 members, so that was kind of cool. I wish that we had a lot more. Did you see Catherine on, Justin?
no, I didn't.
She was mentioning that she might not be able to join with us, so.
Well, yeah, I maxed out at 37 at one point, and then as soon as the Chamber of Commerce left, we were down to about 32 for a little bit, and then right towards the end we were about 27. So
Yeah, I seen that. So awesome. Well, everyone, have a good night, and we'll see each other in April.
sounds good.
Good night, Cheryl. Bye, Mike. See you later, Frank. I see only a few people left. Take care.
Yeah, there's 11. So
Perfect.